Most people believe the biggest threats to their future are obvious: failure, bad decisions, missed opportunities. But what if the real danger is something far quieter? What if the thing slowly shaping your future isn't failure at all, but comfort? Not the kind of comfort that comes after hard work, the kind that quietly teaches you to avoid anything uncertain, uncomfortable, or difficult. Because the most dangerous forms of comfort never feel dangerous while they're happening. They feel normal. You tell yourself you'll start next week. You'll take the risk when you're more prepared. You'll have the difficult conversation when the timing feels right. And every excuse sounds reasonable. That's what makes it so difficult to recognize. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to abandon their potential. It happens gradually. One postponed decision, one avoided challenge, one uncomfortable situation escaped instead of faced. At first, nothing seems wrong. You still go to work. You still make plans. You still believe you're moving forward. But beneath the surface, something begins changing. The opportunities you once would have taken start feeling too risky. The goals that once excited you start feeling unrealistic. The version of yourself you imagined becoming starts feeling strangely distant. Because a person doesn't become weaker overnight. They become weaker every time they choose temporary relief over necessary growth. A person doesn't suddenly lose confidence. They lose confidence each time they walk away from something they know they should face. Most people never notice this happening. Not because they're careless, because the process is so gradual. Then one day, they look back and wonder why life feels smaller than it once did, why courage feels harder to access, why they no longer trust themselves the way they once did. And a painful realization begins to emerge. The person they wanted to become didn't disappear overnight. They slowly traded that version of themselves away for comfort. A day here, a week there, a challenge avoided, a version of themselves left behind. Until years pass, and by the time they notice what's been happening, the comfort that once felt like protection has quietly become a prison. Because the real danger isn't avoiding discomfort once. The real danger begins when avoidance stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like who you are. The human mind does not care whether a pattern is helping you or hurting you. It only cares whether the pattern is familiar. That's what makes comfort so deceptive. At first, avoidance feels like a temporary decision. You postpone one difficult conversation. You delay one important goal. You choose distraction over action. And afterward, life continues. Nothing terrible happens, which is exactly why the brain learns the wrong lesson. It begins associating avoidance with safety. Relief starts feeling like success. And every time that pattern repeats, it becomes easier to repeat again. This is how comfort slowly rewires a person, not through dramatic failures, through repetition, because the brain adapts to whatever it experiences most often. If you repeatedly face challenges, discomfort becomes less intimidating. But if you repeatedly escape challenges, avoidance becomes easier to justify. Eventually, the mind stops questioning the pattern altogether. That's when something important changes. The brain no longer sees avoidance as a reaction. It starts seeing it as identity. You stop thinking, "I'm avoiding this challenge," and start thinking, "I'm just not the kind of person who does things like that." The behavior becomes a belief, and beliefs are far more powerful than habits. Because once a person believes something about themselves, they begin acting in ways that prove it true. The person who keeps saying they'll start next month eventually stops believing their own promises. The person who repeatedly avoids rejection begins calling themselves unlucky. The person who once dreamed of more slowly lowers their expectations until disappointment feels easier than hope. Not because they failed, because they practiced retreat for so long that it started feeling natural. And the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to recognize, because familiar patterns rarely feel dangerous. They feel justified. That's why so many people stay trapped for years. They aren't fighting a bad habit anymore. They're defending an identity built from repeated excuses, repeated delays, and repeated attempts to stay comfortable. And once avoidance becomes part of who you believe you are, the consequences become much deeper than missed opportunities. Because the next thing comfort takes isn't your ambition, it's your ability to trust yourself. Every promise you break to yourself leaves a mark, and eventually, the person you stop believing in the most is you. The most dangerous consequence of comfort is not weakness, it's self-doubt. Because every time you avoid something you know you should face, a message is sent to your mind, not through words, through actions. And actions are what the brain trusts most. You can tell yourself you're capable. You can repeat positive affirmations. You can spend hours consuming motivational content. But if your actions repeatedly communicate hesitation, fear, and avoidance, the mind listens to those actions instead. That's why self-trust is so fragile. It isn't built by what you say. It's built by what you repeatedly prove. Every difficult conversation you avoid, every promise you make to yourself and break, every morning you tell yourself you'll start tomorrow, the mind notices. Not consciously, quietly, like evidence being collected. At first, the damage seems small. You hesitate a little more. You overthink decisions a little longer. You begin questioning yourself in situations that once felt simple. But eventually, those small moments start creating a larger story, a story about who you are. And once that story takes hold, life begins changing in ways most people never expect. Challenges begin feeling bigger than they are. Risks begin feeling more dangerous than they are. Opportunities begin feeling farther away than they are. Not because reality changed, because your perception changed. The world has not become more intimidating. You have simply stopped trusting your ability to handle it. That's why comfort is so destructive. It doesn't just make people passive, it makes them fragile. A fragile mind is not a weak mind. It's a mind that no longer believes in itself. And when that happens, people begin shrinking their lives without realizing it. They stop applying for opportunities they once would have chased. They stop speaking up when something matters. They stop expecting much from themselves because disappointment feels easier than trying and failing, not because that's who they truly are, but because self-doubt has become more familiar than courage. The tragedy is that most people don't recognize this process while it's happening. They think they're being realistic. They think they're protecting themselves, when in reality, they're adapting to a smaller version of life. And the longer this continues, the more dangerous it becomes. Because eventually, the problem is no longer what you're avoiding. The problem becomes the person you're becoming. A person who no longer sees challenges as opportunities to grow, but as threats to escape. And once that happens, the cost becomes much greater than lost confidence. It becomes the life you never allow yourself to live. Most people think the cost of comfort is obvious. They imagine failure, missed opportunities, unfulfilled goals. But comfort rarely takes those things all at once. It takes them slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. Because when a person stops trusting themselves, something important begins disappearing. Not immediately, not dramatically, little by little. The courage to speak honestly. The courage to take risks. The courage to walk toward uncertainty instead of away from it. Not extraordinary courage, everyday courage, the kind that shapes an entire life. And when that courage begins fading, life starts becoming smaller. Not because the world changed, but because your relationship with difficulty changed. The challenges that once felt possible begin feeling overwhelming. The opportunities you once would have pursued begin looking too risky. The future you imagined begins feeling less realistic. Because when self-trust disappears, discomfort no longer feels like growth. It feels like danger. And that's how comfort quietly creates fragility, not physical fragility, psychological fragility. A person becomes increasingly dependent on certainty, familiarity, and emotional safety. Yet life rarely offers any of those things for long. But the deepest cost is not confidence, it's self-respect. Because self-respect is built when your actions remain loyal to your values and destroyed when your actions repeatedly betray them. The mind remembers every promise you break, every excuse you justify, Every moment you choose temporary relief over necessary growth. At first, those moments seem insignificant, but over time they accumulate, and eventually people begin feeling disconnected from themselves. Not because they hate who they are, but because they remember who they could be. That's the hidden grief comfort creates. A person promises they'll start next month. Next month becomes next year. The difficult conversation remains unspoken. The dream remains postponed. The risk remains untaken. And because nothing collapses immediately, the pattern continues, year after year, until one day they look back and realize something painful. The life they wanted wasn't taken from them. It slowly drifted away while they were trying to stay comfortable, waiting for confidence, waiting for certainty, waiting for the perfect moment, waiting for a version of life where discomfort finally disappeared. But it never did, and that's when the real cost becomes impossible to ignore. Not failure, regret. The realization that the person you could have become was never beyond your reach. They were waiting on the other side of the discomfort you kept avoiding, and the years between who you are and who you could have been quietly disappeared. The good news is that comfort did not change who you are. It only changed what you've practiced. And anything built through repetition can be rebuilt through repetition. That's what most people never realize. They spend years believing they've become weak, unmotivated, undisciplined, stuck, when in reality they've simply spent years training themselves in the wrong direction. Because the problem was never comfort itself. The problem was dependence. Comfort was meant to be a place you visit, not a place you live. The danger begins when comfort stops being something you enjoy and becomes something you need. Because the moment discomfort feels unacceptable, growth becomes impossible. And that's why the solution is not to become a different person. The solution is to start practicing different choices, not massive changes, not dramatic transformations. Small acts of courage repeated consistently, because fear and courage grow the same way, through repetition. The comfort zone did not shrink your life overnight. It happened, one avoided challenge at a time, one excuse at a time, one retreat at a time. The way back follows the same principle. One difficult conversation at a time, one promise kept to yourself at a time, one uncomfortable decision at a time. At first, these actions seem insignificant, but something important begins happening beneath the surface. The mind starts collecting new evidence, evidence that you can handle uncertainty, evidence that discomfort is survivable, evidence that fear does not have to make your decisions. And slowly, self-trust begins returning. Not because you suddenly feel different, because you've proven something different. That's the mistake many people make. They wait to feel ready before they act. But readiness is usually created through action, not before it. You don't become brave and then face difficulty. You face difficulty and discover that you're braver than you thought. And with every challenge faced instead of avoided, something starts changing. The story you've been telling yourself begins losing its power. The story that says you're incapable. The story that says you're stuck. The story that says you've already fallen too far behind. Because those stories were never facts. They were conclusions built from repetition. And repetition can always be rewritten. Eventually, something unexpected happens. The comfort zone that once felt like protection begins looking like a prison. Because the thing you were searching for inside comfort was never comfort at all. It was strength. And strength was never waiting inside certainty. It was waiting inside the challenges you kept avoiding. That's why the question is no longer, how can I make life easier? The question becomes, how can I become stronger? And that single shift changes everything. Because the years behind you may be fixed, but the person you become next is not.
Maybe the most dangerous thing about comfort was never what it took from you. Maybe it was what it convinced you to believe. Because after years of avoiding discomfort, many people begin telling themselves a story. A story that feels true. A story repeated so often that it starts feeling permanent. They tell themselves they're not confident. not disciplined, not courageous, not capable of change. And eventually those beliefs stop feeling like opinions. They start feeling like identity. But what if those beliefs were never your identity? What if they were only the result of years spent practicing avoidance? Because that's the thing most people never consider. If comfort can condition a mind, then courage can condition one too. If repeated avoidance can create fear, then repeated action can create strength. If years of retreat can teach you to doubt yourself, then years of facing difficulty can teach you to trust yourself again. The mistake is believing that the version of you that exists today is the final version. It isn't. It's simply the version shaped by what you've repeatedly practiced. Nothing more, nothing less. The person who avoids challenges today is not permanently trapped. The person who doubts themselves today is not permanently broken. The person who feels stuck today is not permanently lost. Because identity is far more flexible than most people realize. The human mind is constantly adapting, constantly learning, constantly reshaping itself around what it repeatedly experiences. That's why comfort was able to influence you in the first place. And it's exactly why growth can influence you next. Not through one life-changing moment, not through one burst of motivation, but through repeated moments that slowly create a different self-image. A person who once stayed silent begins speaking honestly. A person who once avoided risk begins taking responsibility. A person who once ran from difficulty begins facing it. And eventually something remarkable happens. The old story begins losing its power. The story that said you're incapable. The story that said you're weak. The story that said you've already fallen too far behind. Because those stories were never facts, they were conclusions. Conclusions built from repetition. And repetition can always be rewritten. That's what makes this realization so powerful. You are not trapped by your past. You are not defined by your worst habits. You are not destined to remain the person comfort trained you to be. You have simply become what you've repeatedly practiced. Which means the future is not decided by your past conditioning. It's decided by what you begin conditioning today. Because your potential never disappeared. Your future never disappeared. The stronger version of you never disappeared. They've been waiting patiently on the other side of the discomfort you've spent years avoiding. And maybe that's the truth this entire journey has been leading toward. The greatest cost of comfort was never the opportunities you missed. It was the belief that the person you could become was slipping further away. But that person is still there, still waiting, still possible. The only question is whether you're willing to meet them. Because if comfort has been quietly shaping your future until now, what kind of future could be created if courage took its place?